The history of the chiffon pie dates back to the early 1900s, when this man, Monroe Boston Strauss, who would eventually earn the title of the Pie King, took over his uncle's pie business. As a way of sparking interest in the bakery and combating the ever-growing popularity of cakes, he began touring the country teaching others to make pie and developing signature pies, one of which was the wildly popular chiffon pie. By today's standards, the pie would be considered a food safety hazard, given that its filling consists of a custard folded with whipped raw egg whites. The whipped whites impart an airy mousse-like texture to the filling, which wowed people in the 20th century, but gives people in the 21st century the heebie-jeebies. Luckily, I'm not squeamish about raw eggs, since the risk of contracting salmonella from raw eggs is actually rather low, so I feel pretty comfortable making and eating this pie. The original chiffon pie used a graham cracker crust, also invented by Monroe, but for my reference pie, I'm using a crust made from pie dough. I don't think the Pie King would be too upset. I think he'd just be happy I'm not making cake. I opted to make a lemon chiffon pie, specifically this one by Saveur, and for the blind baked pie crust, I'm testing a recipe developed by Christopher Kimball and Erica Bruce of Milk Street. Macarons are 2 almond meringue cookies pressed around a creamy filling, and I'm super excited to have gotten macarons because they are part of our modern zeitgeist, and yet I've never made them before, so it's really about time. The first known appearance of the macaron was actually not in France, but in Italy during the 8th century, specifically in Venetian monasteries. In its earliest form, macarons were served as single cookies made of almonds, egg whites, and sugar. The macarons made its way to France in the 16th century when an Italian noblewoman named Catherine de' Medici married Henry II, the King of France. But it wasn't until 3 centuries later, the 19th century, that macarons were served the way as we know it. 2 almond meringue discs filled with a layered buttercream, jam, or ganache. This iteration of the macaron was developed in Paris, and so was named the Parisian macaron. For my reference macarons, I'll be sandwiching a chocolate ganache between 2 chocolate macaron shells, and using this macaron base batter recipe developed by Chef Steps. Yeah, I just got heavy cream everywhere. Oops. Whipped cream does not need much help moving down a piping bag. Ugh. So, there were a few places in this recipe where I made mistakes. Here are my notes for future Ariel and anyone interested in making this recipe. Number 1, fully hydrate each gelatin granule to ensure that the final product has a smooth texture and completely sets. Number 2, don't let the custard base set before adding in the whipped egg whites. The Saveur recipe includes no explicit warning about this, but in his book, the Pie King does say that this will result in a lumpy filling, and I did experience lumpiness when filling the pie shell. If this does happen to you, you can reheat the base to soften the gelatin before adding the egg whites, but this option slipped my mind in the frenzy of filming. Just be sure not to heat it above 212 degrees Fahrenheit, as gelatin's strength rapidly declines above this temperature. Interestingly though, when tasting the pie after letting it set in the fridge overnight, I didn't detect any lumpiness in the filling, but I'm sure I knocked out more air than ideal when incorporating the egg whites. Number 3, follow Stella Park's low and slow approach to blind baking. I blind baked the pie crust using the directions specified in the Milk Street recipe, but found that the center of the crust was severely underbaked relative to the edges. The texture of this pie is so weird. It jiggles. Stop! Tom! Yeah, it jiggles. And just listen to this. It sounds like Velcro being pulled apart. On the tongue, it feels very light and airy. I imagine if I ate sea foam, it would invoke the same textural experience. In terms of taste, the filling is very lemony from the zest, and it strikes a good balance between sweet and tart. The crust is buttery, which pairs well with the tartness of the filling, and the crust is supremely tender, and it has a crumbly flake, so under a little pressure from the roof of your mouth, it falls apart into buttery crumbs. I personally don't think the whipped cream adds much to the pie, and neither did Tom, who loves whipped cream. I'm just kidding, I wouldn't do that to you. I bet you're pretty impressed right now. Well, don't be. I mean, if you are impressed, that's really nice of you, but I actually ran into a lot of issues when making these macarons. Issue 1, too large of a piping tip. There are people who prefer a half-inch diameter tip for piping macarons. I personally found it to be slightly too large, so next time I'll probably try a 1/4 inch tip for better flow control. Issue 2, deflation. So I baked my macarons at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 minutes with a convection oven. At the 11-minute mark, the macaron cookies looked great. They developed such amazing feet in the oven, and when I took them out to perform this test,
you're gonna check if they move. They don't move anymore, so we're good.
They deflated. I thought it'd be fine to check on them. This website also tells me that you can perform the wiggle test to check for doneness, but what they don't tell you is that you need to let the macarons completely rise and set before testing them. Otherwise they collapse. Issue 3, which is related to issue 2, underbaked macaron shells. Temperature and bake times vary from recipe to recipe, and ideally you should test a variety of temperatures and cooking times to find out what works given your oven and batter. Ignoring what I learned in grad school and ignoring an explicit warning from Chef Steps, I placed my bet on one temperature and time combination. 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 minutes with the fan on. I mean, you know what happens. They deflated because they were underdone, so I had to return them to the oven. Issue 4, keeping the ganache at a pipeable consistency. I mean, I don't even need to explain this. This clip tells you everything. Issue 5, also related to issue 4, don't wait too long to cap the macarons after you've piped the ganache. The ganache will set, and it won't spread evenly, and it won't reach the very edges of the shell, which is necessary for proper hydration during the aging phase of the assembled macarons. Macarons aren't difficult to make. What is difficult is mastering them. And even though my macarons aren't perfect, they're still pretty tasty. The macarons are very chocolatey. The dark chocolate ganache balances the sweet chocolate meringue cookie, and you really experience a gradient of textures. The outside is light and crisp, then you reach the chewy center of the macaron shell, then you reach the velvety ganache center. And the feet are crunchy. So here's what I'm thinking for the hybrid. I'm going to make a pie shell using the chocolate macaron cookie batter and fill this shell with a strawberry chiffon pie filling. I'm then going to top the filling with a macaron cookie that's been piped out into a lattice pattern. The hardest part of this hybrid will be making the pie shell. I'm going to separate the pie shell into 2 parts, the base and the wall. To build the wall of macaron, I need an outer wall and an inner wall that can contain the batter vertically while the batter is baking. I'm using this springform pan as the outer wall and making an inner wall from parchment paper. The relief slips allow the parchment paper to form a circle. Again, the idea is to pipe the batter between these 2 walls. And to prevent the inner wall from collapsing inward, I decided to fill the inner circle with sugar. The weight of the sugar will also prevent the batter from seeping underneath the relief slips. Once I made my mold, I whipped up a second batch of chocolate macaron batter and was ready to start constructing the crust. To make the lattice macaron top, I filled a piping bag fitted with a 1/4-inch tip with batter and piped 3 different size lattice tops, since I wasn't sure how much the batter would spread and expand in the oven. I baked the tops at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 21 minutes. For the base, the goal is to achieve a flat surface, so I piped 62 grams of batter in concentric circles, placed a piece of parchment paper on the surface of the batter, then smoothed the surface. It wasn't clear how long it would take the base to fully bake, so I baked the base for 50 minutes at 285 degrees Fahrenheit, then removed the springform pan and parchment paper, and continued baking it until it looked completely dry. Now, for the scary part, the wall of macaron cookie. I lined the bottom and sides of the springform pan with parchment paper and positioned the inner wall inside the springform pan. I then filled the inner circle with sugar and piped macaron batter between the outer and inner walls, trying to pipe as evenly as possible and without disturbing the mold. I baked the wall at 285 degrees Fahrenheit for 53 minutes, removed the springform pan and parchment paper, then returned it to the oven for another 16 minutes. After removing the wall from the oven and letting it cool, I removed the inner wall and sugar. Removing all the sugar was a struggle because it had started to clump. By heating sugar in the oven, you're essentially caramelizing the sugar. Water is a byproduct of caramelization and also promotes sugar clumping. The wall actually broke into 2 pieces, but it was super easy to piece them back together. Next, I moved on to making the strawberry chiffon filling, this time making sure to mix the whipped egg whites into the cooked custard before the custard set. Another place where I deviated from the original lemon chiffon pie recipe was in how I whipped my egg whites. Rather than whipping the whites by themselves, I added sugar. When whipping egg whites, the egg white proteins uncoil and interlink, entrapping a network of air bubbles and water droplets. By adding sugar into the equation, you stabilize the egg white foam by increasing the viscosity of the water in the foam, slowing the rate at which water can escape from the protein mesh. Another deviation is that I whipped the meringue to medium peaks rather than stiff peaks. To channel the buttery pie crust of the chiffon pie, I'm serving the hybrid with a side of browned whipped heavy cream. To make this toasted cream, I added 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda to 473 grams of heavy cream and pressure cooked the cream at full pressure for 2 hours. The high heat from the pressure cooker and the alkaline environment created by the baking soda triggers and speeds up the Maillard reaction, which is the same reaction primarily responsible for the flavors developed in brown butter. After the cream cooled, I whipped it into whipped cream. Once I had all the component parts made, I assembled the hybrid. I attached the macaron base and wall together using chocolate ganache as glue and spackled the edges to prevent filling leakage. I then filled the shell with the chiffon filling and topped the whole thing with a 4.5-inch lattice top. After resting the hybrid in the fridge overnight for 18 hours, here are the results. And oh boy, was this a delicious hybrid. I know I said the lemon filling was light and airy, but this strawberry chiffon filling is so light and so airy, very much like a mousse, but you still get the same noise as before. The strawberry flavor is very delicate, but it's delicious, especially when paired with the chocolate macaron crust, which has a delicate chocolate flavor that comes from the few grams of Dutch cocoa powder we added in the temps pour tante. And again, the tartness of the filling balances the sweetness of the crust. All 3 parts of the crust absorb moisture from the filling, but to varying degrees. The top has completely softened, the wall has softened, but still maintains a slight crunch. As for the base, the surface that's been in contact with the filling is chewy, but then gradates into crunch. Like the whipped cream and the lemon chiffon pie, I'm not sure if the toasted whipped cream pairs well with the hybrid. The whipped cream tastes strongly of brown butter and overwhelms the delicate strawberry flavor. The pie, however, can stand up to the cream when you get a bite that includes chocolate ganache. I'm pretty happy with how this hybrid turned out, but I do have some notes. In future trials of this hybrid, I'll apply a thin layer of ganache along the entire interior of the macaron wall to decrease moisture transfer, and I'm also thinking that I'll let the filling completely set in the crust and apply the lattice top when I'm ready to serve the dessert, or a few hours before I'm ready to serve. You can find the full recipe by following the link in the description. If you make this hybrid, please leave a comment telling me what you think, upload a photo on Instagram, and be sure to tag me. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments section what you would have done to hybridize these 2 desserts. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Why did you do that?
To show them the chewiness.
It's very chewy.